So sitting in front of us right now is one of our ignition controlled Anderson kits, and we're going to show you how to install this into a vehicle. It is a universal kit. It's designed for all different types of vehicles. One of the main designs of this Anderson kit is to suit those vehicles that have a variable voltage or a smart alternator, which this next gen Ford Ranger does have. And we can tell that simply by looking at the negative terminal. It has this black module here. That module registers all of the current going in and out of the battery. And so we need to make our electrical connections on the body side of that module so that it can calculate that current entering and exiting the battery. So let's go ahead and install this kit into this next gen Ford Ranger, show you how to do it in this vehicle, and you'll be able to follow a similar procedure in many other vehicles as well. So what I'm going to start by doing is just finding the relay, and you'll see there's a short run to our main fuse holder that connects to the battery. So I'm just going to lay that out of the way for now, just sit it on top of the engine. Because what I want to do is find the other end of the harness, which has our Anderson on it. Because the first step we're really going to do is to get all this cable out of the way by routing it underneath the car and towards the rear. So I'll sit that there, and just keeping in mind, I've already got a bit of a plan for this car. I'm going to mount the relay over here, our cable come around and make the connections to the battery. So just keeping that in mind, think of the way that I'm going to route my cable. So I'm thinking I'm going to want to cable tie to this main Ford electrical harness. So I'll make sure I go beside that for a cable tie. And having the same thought in mind as I drop down towards the chassis rail. And there's a Ford harness straight down, and a lot of vehicles will have an electrical harness down here that starts running towards the rear. So let's just thread our cable all the way through. Okay, so now that most of our cable is threaded through, we can start to lay our cable and our relay into position. And our first step is really to mount the relay. So in this case, it comes with a nylock nut on the back of the mount there for our earth terminal. But in this case, the Ford body has a threaded 6mm hole in there. So we can discard the nut and just use that bolt to go straight into the hole. So I've just discarded that nut for this setup. Just going to place that over the hole. And I'm going to mount our relay into position. Okay, so now that our cable is pulled through from the engine bay to under the car, continuing to keep in mind that we want to follow things that we can cable tie to. This Ford electrical harness right here, perfect. So going from inside the chassis rail, I just want to follow the electrical harnesses that I can see here, keeping in mind I can cable tie to them. My cable's on the inside of the chassis rail, so the engine side of the chassis rail. So what I want to do is feed it up across the top of the chassis rail. And you'll notice a Ford electrical harness running over the top. And that gets our cable on the outer side of the chassis rail. And then we can start, you can see our electrical harness running around the body mount here. So we just want to keep following that past our Ford harness here towards the rear. Not cable tying anything at the moment, just getting our cable into position. So I've just moved towards the rear now. So right behind the camera is just the rear wheel. Okay, so you can see our Ford electrical harness now starts to duck up towards the top of the body. So what we want to do is follow that up and back over the chassis rail to the inside. We're grabbing our cable like so. And the reason for that is inside the chassis rail now, we've got a great Ford harness to continue securing to. So you'll see inside now we have a Ford electrical harness, and it runs all the way towards the rear of the vehicle. So we can continue to follow that the entire length. So once again, we're just following that electrical harness over any fuel lines, keeping in mind that we want a cable tie to it later. So we're at the fuel tank now, following over top of the fuel tank, continuing to follow that harness
We've got good access over the chassis rail. I can get my hand right over the chassis rail, continue following that electrical harness towards the rear wheel here. Now just the start of the tub mount, just got to feed it through a little bit until we can grab it at the back of the fuel tank. So you can see the body mount that we just ran the cable over here. So our cable's on the back side of that body mount. So we've got the fuel tank right here, our spring for the rear suspension there. What we want to do is go over this part of the body here, right near the tank filler, because on the inside of this chassis rail, we have a forward electrical harness again that we can start securing to. So I'm just going to thread my cable up here. So I'm starting to see the cable on the inside of that chassis rail. Okay, so I've got that harness now. I'm going to pull that cable through. Okay, so I've got my cable at the back of the fuel tank now. I'm just going to continue to push that towards the spare tyre, and I can see it's falling down just near the spare tyre. So now I can go move to behind the rear wheel. So grabbing our cable again from under the vehicle, just make sure we go across the top of the chassis rail. Following those forward electrical harnesses, we want to be on the outside of the chassis rail now. So now that we've routed our Anderson plug all the way down to the rear, it's time to mount it next to our trailer plug. You'll notice in the kit there's a bracket. It's designed to mount it beside the trailer plug, and also in the kit is an Anderson cover. So our Anderson will be mounted inside this cover, and it is designed to be mounted beside the trailer plug. So the first step in the installation here is to remove the existing Ford trailer plug by undoing these two Torx bolts. So now that our trailer plug has been removed, we next want to open up the Anderson plug cover. So it's just a Phillips head screwdriver there, and I'm just holding the nut on the back. Once that's undone, you'll see the Anderson cover comes completely apart. There's a lot of mounting accessories in there that we can just set aside. Now the next thing we want to take out is half of this grommet. So you'll see it's in two pieces. So leave the bottom half in, and you'll see a series of 4 ridges inside that cover, and there's also 4 ridges on the side of our Anderson plug. So we're looking to match those ridges up. Just open that lid to give us a little more room. Sit that into position. Now I'm still holding that nut with my finger on the back. Next we want to insert that rubber grommet that we took out. You notice that it's got little indentations. We can line them up with our cables, so make sure our cables are sitting in the indentations. With that Phillips head screw that we took out, we want to line that up with the front hole in the Anderson plug. And line up our rubber grommet again in the groove at the rear. And then we can do that Phillips head screw back up. Like that. So we've prepared our Anderson. So the next thing we want to do is install our Anderson cover onto the plate. So we've got all of our holes line up there, and you'll see included in the kit is a bunch of bolts and nuts to complete this install. So let's open up our pack of bolts on the back of the car here. You'll see there's also a spare fuse holder to set aside. Okay, so using the bolts there, we're going to place them through. Put a nut on the other side. So we use 4 bolts to secure this. So this installation is being done on a Ford Ranger, but it's suitable for a lot of different layouts. So on this setup, we're going to put the bracket under the trailer plug and mount it in there nice and snug and tight. If there's not enough room for that, you can also mount this cover on the other side, so it's actually facing down under the bracket.
So there's a lot of different combinations. We can turn the bracket around, have the Anderson this side. If the trailer plug's on the other side, we may need to do that as well. But for this setup, we're sitting that bracket. You can see the holes line up with the existing trailer plug holes. So we just want to line those up. We can either use 2 bolts supplied in our kit or just reinstall the original Ford ones. And then we can just secure those bolts into place, make sure they're tight. So we've completed this part of our install. We've mounted our Anderson next to the trailer plug. The last thing we need to do is go up to the front and make our electrical connections. So now that our accessories have been mounted in the rear, it's time to get under the car and secure our harness all the way back to the auxiliary battery using the cable ties supplied in the kit. We'll see our harness coming straight down in between the inner wall and the outer wall of the tub. So it'll go straight across the top of the chassis rail where we can see that existing Ford electrical harness right near the spare tyre. So right from this point we can start securing our harness into position. I've just left a little bit of slack going up to the electrical panel, just in case we ever need to pull it out in the tub. We have a little bit of play. We don't want to have it super tight that we can't get it out. So just a little bit of slack there. And then I've got my first cable tie on. I'm just going to keep making my way down the Ford electrical harness. From this position, laying behind the rear wheel, I can make it to the fuel tank. So I've used 3 cable ties in that little section. I'm going to cut the tags off them. So now it's time to secure our harness. Laying in front of the rear wheel now, we've got the fuel tank right here. Looking towards the front of the vehicle, we have our harness already laying into position from earlier. So using the cable ties in the kit, we have that Ford harness running in between, or on top of the chassis rail, in between the fuel tank there. So I can see it through the gap. I can feel it. I can get my hand over the chassis rail. There's a lot of room here. So I'm getting into the position where I can see it up there, reaching over with a cable tie, and I can get both hands in there. So I'm placing the cable tie under the Ford harness, grabbing it with my finger, making sure our cable is sitting into place and locking that into position. So there's a cable tie on there. Following that same procedure all the way down, so just putting our harness in against that Ford harness. Once we get to the front of the fuel tank, it's quite accessible and visible. So here's the front of our fuel tank. Here's our Ford harness. And this is our harness that we laid into position earlier. So you can see it's quite accessible, visible, easy access just to get some cable ties around. Now we're pretty much approaching the passenger seat area now. And you can see this harness heads across to the gearbox, so we can't really follow that anymore. What we do is have our harness, as we placed earlier, sitting across the top, coming to the back side of the chassis rail, or the outer edge of the chassis rail, and then we've got a new Ford electrical harness that we can follow. I'll put a cable tie on there, and then we'll move the camera so you can see where we're talking about. So this is the cable tie I've just put on. So our harnesses come from the inside of the chassis rail to follow this electrical harness on the outside of the chassis rail. Same procedure, just cable tying to it as we go. So now we're facing the front on that electrical harness. It's our front wheel here. So just using more cable ties to route towards the front. Around our body mount here, we have our harness goes into a plastic shroud, so we can go around that plastic shroud.
So making sure our cable goes across that body mount there, around the outside. And then in between the mudguard and that body mount, we can see more electrical harnesses. We can reach up and put a cable tie there. It's going to get us nice and secure for our run up the inside of the firewall from the engine bay. So now that we're secure all the way into the bottom of our run up through the firewall, it's just time to cut the tags off all of the cable ties that we've put on. So now we can head up to the engine bay and pull the rest of the cable up. So this is our harness that we've secured underneath the car. Now the next point, and this may change depending on accessories and where everything is in the engine bay, but there's a nice bracket here, a steel bracket that's got a hole in it. So I'm going to put my first cable tie around here. Now just make sure that we stick away from these aircon aluminium lines, anything hot or moving, because we are in the engine bay now. So just be aware of where our cable's sitting, anywhere we can secure it to. So I've got this bracket, that's nice and secure. The next spot I want to aim for is the forward electrical harness again. So you'll notice there's a little bracket there. We could attach it to that or straight to the forward harness. So now that we've mounted our relay, we've secured our harness all the way to the rear and made our connections down the back, it's time to make our electrical connections up the front. There's two sections to this. Firstly, you'll see our ignition wire, and that's designed to tap into the engine bay fuse box, pick up our ignition signal to turn the relay on and off. The second part is our main high current loom that's designed to carry the high current down to our camper or caravan, down to the Anderson at the rear. So let's start by firstly making our connections to the battery. On our positive, you'll see a row of bolts that we can decide to connect to. Any of these are fine, they're all straight to the positive terminal of the battery. So let's start by doing our positive. Now using a 10mm socket, we're just going to remove one of those, and keeping in mind that we'll want to secure our fuse holder to the battery hold down clamp some way. So just laying our harness the way that we're going to want it to sit at the end, putting that nut back on and securing it into place. So that's made our positive connection there. Our negative connection, much the same, but we want to go on the body side of that module. We don't want to connect to there. So making sure we're going on the point where the cable heads away to the body of the vehicle. Connect our negative terminal there. Securely tighten it into place. So you can see our harness is sitting in a nice position, nice spot to get to the relay there. So the next step is we want to tap into our engine bay fuse box here. So in this case, the Ford Ranger, we've got 3 tabs holding our fuse box into place. So perhaps we'll get the back one, that's probably the hardest one against the wall there. We'll release those two, release that one, and we can put that cap aside for now. Now on the Ford Ranger, we know that we've got a fuse here that we can use, this 10 amp fuse. It's ignition controlled, so we're looking at that row of 5 amps, then we've got a red 10 amp. That's the one we want in the Ranger. In other vehicles, and if we have a video for a dual battery system of a car that has a variable voltage alternator, you'll probably be able to find the information on those videos or our digital instructions under the kit. So if you're not sure, it's not overly important which circuit we use in the fuse box. We're just looking for an ignition controlled circuit, which means when we have the key running or the key turned on, so red lights on the dash, that we have power at the fuse. Then once we turn the car off, we have no power at the fuse. We're looking for a circuit that's powered that way, and we know in the Ranger that this one is that. So we've got the key off in the car at the minute, and I'm just going to remove that fuse and sit it there for now. Also included in the kit for the installation of this Anderson kit is a range of different fuses and outer circuit fuse holders. So you can tell that the fuse that we've taken out is a small micro fuse. It's the same size as this one. So this is the fuse holder we need to use.
There's some 10 amp fuse in there, or we can use the one that we just pulled out of the vehicle if it hasn't been damaged. So we're looking to use the same size fuse into that empty slot in the fuse holder. By replacing that with a 10 amp fuse, it keeps the forward circuit active and allows us to get a little tap off to run our relay. So all we're doing is simply placing that fuse holder into position like that. And next we want to slip our heat shrink over that cable, and we want to place our small cable labelled ignition into that fuse holder. And then we can slip our heat shrink over and shrink that down to hold that connection together. So just using a small blowtorch, a cigarette lighter, some kind of heat source, we just want to shrink that piece of heat shrink down tight. Then laying our cable into position, we have actually taken a little piece out of this fuse box just to allow our cable to come out. This is in no way a sealed fuse box. You can see on the Ford Ranger on the next gen, it's actually just a piece of plastic that sits into another groove of plastic. So we've just taken a nick out of there to allow our cable to come out of the hole. Now we also just want to take a little cut out of the inside of the lid there. Just with a pair of cutters down there. And just take that little lip out as well. Once we've done that, we can put our fuse cover back into position. Just make sure our cable is laying the way that we want it to. Sitting in our groove there. So we can just sit our ignition cable now out of the way, and keep in mind that we can cable tie to our other harness. And you can see that sitting nice and neatly in the engine bay there. So using some of the cable ties supplied in the kit, we're just going to secure our fuse holder lastly. And maybe an extra cable tie just to hold our cable around that hold down clamp. Just cut our cable ties off. And if we just put a little bend there in our cable, we can attach that cover again. So there we go, the installation of our ignition controlled Anderson kit is complete on this next gen Ranger. Sitting nice and neatly there. It's time to now test it. We can do that a couple ways. Turning the key on, we'll hear this relay engage and click in. If you've got a test light, you can go and check that you have power down the rear at the Anderson when you have the key on, and then when you turn the key off, you should lose power at the rear.